On behalf of the Sarah and Chaim Neuberger Education Center and UJA Federation of Greater Toronto, I welcome you to this evening's program. First, I'd like to thank Beth Abraham Yosef of Toronto for hosting this program. Holocaust Education Week is especially grateful to our presenting sponsor, Great Gulf, and to our lead sponsors, Apotek Foundation, which is Honey and Barry Sherman, as well the Azrieli Foundation and the Elizabeth and Tony Comper Foundation. We are proud to have CTV and the National Post as our media sponsors. This is the 34th year of Holocaust Education Week. This year's theme is collaboration. Our program will explore distinct ways in which individuals and groups participated in and responded to the persecution and genocide by the Nazi regime. Complete program guides are available at the back. For changes and updates, please visit our website at www.holocausteducationweek.com. Holocaust Education Week needs your support. Your generous donation will allow us to continue to offer outstanding educational programs for many years to come. Donation cards are provided at all our programs, so please fill out a card or donate online at www.holocausteducationweek.com. We thank you for your generosity. Finally, if you wish to keep your electronic device on, please switch it to silent mode and use it only to inform your friends about Holocaust Education Week and to invite them to our upcoming events. I am confident that you will find this program thought-provoking and informative. Thank you very much.
All set? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are delighted to see this very, very respectable turnout this evening. My name is Rabbi Daniel Karapkin. I'm the senior rabbi here at Beth Avraham Yosef, and we'd like to welcome you all. The Holocaust is something that still to this very day, many of us are either children or even grandchildren of survivors, and it raises so many emotions and very, very deep-seated convictions. Tonight's discussion about Reszo or Rudolf Kasztner and the Kasztner affair, I think, raises a lot of curiosity and interest and perhaps very, very strong emotions on different sides of the issue for those who were brought up with this issue as being an area of controversy. I know that one of the first books that I read about Zionism and about the intertwining and the connections between the early Zionist leaders and the Holocaust was a book called Perfidy. I even actually pulled it off my bookshelf. It was written by a man named Ben Hecht, who was a playwright, and he wrote a very dramatic narrative about the entire Kasztner affair. It was published in 1961. Several years after Kasztner was assassinated in Israel, after having been exposed publicly in Israeli courts as being a Nazi collaborator. The accusations, of course, were that not only did he help a Nazi, Kurt Becher, be exonerated in the Nuremberg trials, but also that he knowingly deceived Hungarian Jews that they were being shipped to Auschwitz to be exterminated, to be gassed, to be murdered, and collaborated with the Nazis in this lie that they were going to a nice camp temporarily to be able to regroup and to have a wonderful existence. And therefore he was credited with being responsible for thousands of Jews going to their deaths and only saving a handful of the elite that the Zionist leadership at the time wanted Kasztner to be able to save. This is a very sordid tale, and of course it is intertwined with political partisan politics, and there's a lot here. And one thing that we know from history is that history is a very, very gray thing that can sometimes be mutated and twisted to different people's advantage. And so it's very important to be able to, if there is another narrative, to allow that narrative to be heard, especially according to the Jewish faith. We believe in being dan lekaf zuchut, which means to allow the benefit of the doubt to be given to a person, especially when that individual is not present to defend himself or herself, because you are dealing with people who are no longer in this world. So all we ask is that you leave an open mind, listen to our presenter tonight, Anna Porter, who is the author of Kasztner's Train, and let us try and be able to objectively, as we possibly can, be able to listen to the presentation this evening. I'm here to introduce our moderator, Mr. Chaim Klein, who is a proud member of the BAYT and also a friend and a teacher of a number of my children. Mr. Klein was born in Paris. He is the oldest of 3 sons of Holocaust survivors. He's married to Mindy Klein. I think that's the most impressive part of your bio. He has 3 married daughters and an assortment of grandchildren. Before moving to Toronto, lived in Montreal, and above all, he is an accomplished educator, having taught in Toronto since you've come here to Toronto. You've been a teacher in various schools, including Chat, Community Hebrew Academy of Toronto, and Darchei Torah, and other venues as well. And I have to tell you that what makes Mr. Klein, in my opinion, unique among educators is that of all of the teachers that my children have had, and they've had many, I have never heard my children speak of a teacher in such glowing terms as Mr. Klein. He is the person that my children want to walk home from synagogue back to his apartment. They want to engage him in conversation, both inside and outside of the classroom. This is a testament to the fact that he truly is able to connect with his students and is a fascinating and engaging speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we please welcome Mr. Chaim Klein.
I'm not used to such effusive praise. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening sponsored by Holocaust Education Week. BAYT, I'm sure, is proud to sponsor this event. And just on a personal note, I'd like to thank the BAYT for having this event, as it gave me the opportunity to get this book by Anna Porter autographed. Without this, I probably would not have had a chance. Rabbi Korobkin.
The microphone is hard to hear. Thank you.
Rabbi Korobkin made some comments regarding both the nature of history and the nature of the Kasztner trial or the Kasztner train. I was first exposed to the Kasztner train or the Kasztner issue in much the same manner as Rabbi Korobkin. I was in a school which sought to undermine any legitimacy that secular Zionism had, and this was a vehicle in which the people who were educators at the school thought would be a successful way of doing it. Being young and impressionable, I was 15 at the time, it did impact my way of thinking, and one has to think their way out of various situations in life, and over the years I've had a passing interest, and it wasn't until I bought Anna Porter's book, Kasztner's Train, that I realized that there's a wholly different perspective that one can take on the matter. The Torah tells us, Zachor Yemot Olam, remember the days of past. History is important. History is important not because it necessarily teaches us about the past. Very frequently it fails to teach us about the past, but it's important to know what came before, who came before, how it came before. Voltaire says history is a pack of tricks played on the dead. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. And not having been there, or even having been there, people who survived the experience both have different versions and different memories of exactly what took place. There are people who went through the experience and regard Mr. Kasztner as a hero, and there are people who regard him as a villain. There's no objectivity here that's possible. How much of people's thinking is based on political thinking, how much is based on objectivity, I don't know. I'm not qualified to make that judgment. However, I'd like to quote something from an article that appeared in a magazine called Hakira by Joe Bobker. The article is called "To Flee or Stay," and it addresses the question of whether the Jews in Europe were given proper guidance about leaving or staying. And the conclusion of the article is, the fact is this: not a single Jew knew whether his decision, made with the best of intent, would save a life or hasten the death. One Jew's survival often depended on another Jew's death. What Professor Lawrence L. Wagner, one of the foremost scholars of Holocaust, calls, quote, the choiceless choice. And I think it's important to remember that the choiceless choice is an operative principle in many human affairs. Judgments have to be made. I'm not sure that motivations have to be judged. With this in mind, I'd like to introduce Anna Porter. I knew of Anna Porter long before I read her book. Anna Porter has been one of Canada's most important publishers. She published many of the primary Canadian writers of contemporary history in our period. She was a force in Canadian publishing, and she's written many articles on many subjects. I would almost say she's a polymath. She's written mystery novels. She's written historical matters. She's written on culture. She recently wrote an article on the opening of the Jewish Warsaw Museum on Thursday. It was in Thursday's National Post. And she has been an energetic and involved writer in aspects of Hungarian Jewish life. And when I had the chance to read this book, I was very honored. It is my honor to introduce Anna Porter, and I'd just like to make one final comment. Rabbi Koropkin started by saying that he was grateful that we had a respectable audience. I hope we can say that we're going to have a respectful audience as well. Thank you.
Poland? Anyone? Right. It's the museum is a huge new architectural triumph. I think it's beautiful. Its positioning is really extraordinary. If you've been to Warsaw, you've seen perhaps the ghetto fighters memorial, and it's right across from you walk out the front door, and that's the first thing you see. It's 1,000 years of the history of the Jews in the Palais settlement, and it's beautifully done. I brought this, and I'm leaving it because I brought it specially so I could leave it here today, Rabbi, even though I disagree with you about Ben Hecht, but that's coming up. Now, it's not, the museum is as controversial in many ways as the story of Kasztner, in the sense that as you're walking through these magnificent exhibits and you absorb the truth of all those great things that had happened in the Palais settlement, and all the joy and all the creativity and the printing and the books and everything, the whole time there is this very, very large elephant in the room. And it's with you all the time as you go through. At least it was with me, until you get to the Holocaust, which is when all that, as you all know, was wiped out. 3.5 million Polish Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. I was talking to somebody about this, and a Pole, and he said, it's a little bit like we're walking around with only one leg. We're missing the Jews. I thought, gosh, you should have thought of that a little sooner. Might have been better. Anyway, Just to show you the difference, though, I went to Budapest as well. And you'll probably be reading a little bit about my trip to Budapest in Klein's magazine, which is where I frequently have written about the fascism in Hungary. I hate to say this, having been born there. But I went to see a monument in Freedom Square, actually, just very close to the American Embassy. There is this new monument. And it's called a World War II monument. And there is, well, first of all, aesthetically, it's a catastrophe. It's so bad that you really won't believe how bad a piece of sculpture can be. But that is the least of its problems. Its biggest problem is that the central figure, which I think is supposed to be an angel, it's, not very well dressed, and it's got wings. And I was told that it's a representation both of the Archangel Gabriel and of victimized Hungary. And above this figure, there is a bird with its wings, big wings spread, and it's attacking this poor, defenseless Archangel Gabriel, a.k.a. Hungary. And this originally, I met with a man called Mr. Heisler. Mr. Heisler is the head of the Jewish community in Hungary today, and he, oddly enough, in the same building where the Jewish community used to have its headquarters in Sheep Street. But he was telling me that they had originally, when they first heard of this statue, they all thought it was part of Holocaust commemoration, that the Hungarian government was going to do something absolutely wonderful. Well, eventually they found out what it was. There were protests, and the government did not unveil the statue in any formal way. There were no speeches, none of the sort of things you'd expect. Great big statue sitting in the middle of the square. Actually, it's right above the parking garage. But anyway, not only was it happened during the night. The statue, passes by early in the morning, and suddenly there's the Archangel Gabriel and the swooping German eagle. So just a few steps, however, from that catastrophe is the Church of the Return. And you can't help but notice a very, very large bust of Admiral Horthy. And those of you who have some acquaintance with Hungarian history might recall that Admiral Horthy was the man who was the regent in Hungary during the deportation of almost 500,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And there is the statue. So, on the one hand, the Poles think they're missing the Jews. On the other hand, my old country is coming up with an atrocity of history. So, just in case you happen to go there, Leslie, take a look at it. Now, I want to talk about Reszo Kasztner. The first book I read about Reszo Kasztner was Perfidy by Ben Hecht, which is what the Rabbi started his speech about. It's when I read it, I had no prior knowledge, rumors, the odd story. I had no preconceptions. I was neither for nor against Reszo Kasztner. I was fascinated by his story. And sometime later, I met a man called Peter Monk. Some of you might have heard of. He's in the gold business. And Peter Monk mentioned Reszo Kasztner. He was on the train. He and his entire family were saved by Reszo Kasztner, and therefore he believes, unlike Ben Hecht, that Reszo Kasztner is a hero. His best friend, however, his parents were not on the train. He survived. His father did not. And he believes to this day that Reszo Kasztner was a villain. And the two men are close friends. There's only one subject they never, ever talk about, and that's Kasztner. I started researching the book, or I didn't know it was going to be a book. I thought at the time it might just be a story. I started researching by reading all the accounts I could find, and there are hundreds of them. I read the trial transcripts, and he was, he wasn't charged, and therefore he wasn't convicted of anything. He was the plaintiff. It was the trial was one of criminal libel, and he, or on his behalf, the government of Israel sued Mr. Greenwald, who was a pamphleteer and who had said that Kasztner was a collaborator. And the government of Israel sued on Kasztner's behalf. It's criminal libel. And the trial changed the way people thought history was going to unfold. Because after the first week, when the man who was actually when he was actually trying to get into the courtroom, he was barred from entering because there was no room for him. And he had to explain that he actually was the accused. Kasztner himself had been looking forward to his time in court because he believed, as did Peter Monk, that he had done an extraordinary thing, saving the people who were on the train, one of whom I see over there. But more than that, saving the lowest number is 17,000. The highest is just a little over 20,000. The German count was 20,000, and as you know, the Germans were sticklers for numbers. They, through Strasshof, which was a holding camp, and I'm going to come back to that. Let's go back to, very simply, the story of Reszo Kasztner. I could read all this, but then I can't see you looking either friendly or unfriendly, so. Reszo Kasztner was a small-time Kolozsvár, Cluj lawyer. He did have some thoughts about being better than most people because, as a lawyer, he was used as a middleman with the authorities used by fellow Jews who got in trouble with the authorities. They would call Reszo and say, can you help with this or that? Yeah. And he did. He did quite a lot of that. So he began to see himself as really somebody quite superior. And that's the sort of thing that can happen if you're called upon to stand up for other people. He married well, exceptionally well. He married the daughter of a wealthy man. And you would think that he would have been exceptionally happy with that, but he was not particularly faithful. This is something that nobody in this congregation I know would have any experience with. But unfortunately, Hungarian men have a tendency to have wandering eyes. And he did, in fact, as events unfolded, he was on the one hand married, and on the other hand, he had a lover for most of his life. To make it actually even more interesting, his lover was the wife of his best friend. And somehow everybody put up with this, which is, to me, somewhat astonishing, but it's different times. Don't look so shocked, sir. It is different times. Anyway, the idea for saving people already began when he was in Cluj-Koložvár. He was, there were a lot of refugees coming, mainly from Poland, but everywhere else in the east. As you've got to remember that up until the Germans marched in to Hungary in 1944 March, up until then, although things were not rosy by any manner of means, and Hungary was, incidentally, the first civilized country to have passed, civilized, in quotation marks, country to have passed anti-Jewish laws. The first country in Europe in modern times. So, however, life was not bad. These refugees were coming from places where life had been bad, and life got intolerable, and Kasztner and a small group already in Cluj began to help them, collecting clothes, getting money, trying to help them get out of the country, trying to get them into Constanza, get a boat. He was a Zionist, so the idea of going to Israel seemed like a very attractive one to him. His brother was already in Israel at this time. So everything was, in flux, the war, everything was happening, and happening very fast. Hungary traded its honor under the aforementioned Horthy for pieces of territory that had been lost under the Versailles Treaty's side room, the Treaty of Trianon, which Hungarians to this day consider the greatest catastrophe in the world. They lost this territory, and Horthy got it back. And in order to get it back, there were certain payments he had to make, and the payments were in human lives. Some of you may know about Kamenets-Podolsky. Yes. Anyway, none of this has to do with Kasztner. Some of you may know about when Hungarian soldiers marched into Novi Sad in the south, and pretty much all the Jews were murdered then. Partisans were killed too, but some of the Jews were partisans. Kasztner, when Hungary marched into this Transylvania, part of Hungary, then Romania, this time part of Romania, Hungary got it back, and at that moment, all Jewish life changed for the worse. For one thing, he lost his job. Most people who were working in any kind of civil service, they all lost their jobs. Teachers lost their jobs, and on and on and on. He went to Budapest and continued his work there, trying to help refugees. There were thousands of refugees from other parts of Europe. How much time do I have? Okay, I'm at the beginning of this story. I'm going to make it faster. He got together with a group of people, which included Joel Brand and his wife Hansi, whom I mentioned before. Hansi was his lover, but not right at the beginning. That came later. He got together with them, and they set up a committee to save Jewish lives. And the committee, right from the very beginning, was helping people who had come from other parts of Europe looking for peace, maybe. And Hungary at this point was still not entirely in the war. This is before the Second Army was finally annihilated. So they were involved right from the very beginning. And when, hurrying along here, when the Germans marched in, the rescue committee met in Budapest in a little bar, and they tried to figure out whether they had enough ammunition or guns or knives or anything to try and fight back. They did not. The idea for trying to save Jews on a grand scale came a little bit later. It actually was the idea of Rabbi Dov Weissmandl, who was an Orthodox rabbi in Slovakia. He believed that he could bargain with the Germans because they were as corrupt as everybody else, and it was going to be possible to buy lives. His idea was to buy 1 million lives. And that idea came to Kasztner's group through Gizzy Fleischman, who came from Slovakia to tell them and ask for help and ask for money. But, of course, they had very little money, and they couldn't help. They asked for help from overseas, and it was not coming. And it's not Ben Hecht's fault. He had a huge meeting of thousands of people trying to organize people to help in New York, to help the Jews in Europe. But it wasn't going to happen. The Joint was able to send some funds, but nothing was going to add up to enough as far as Rabbi Weissmandl could see. Gizzy Fleischman was murdered by the Germans. Rabbi Weissmandl survived. Just a chance, as we heard earlier. Kasztner, when having noted that the money wasn't going to be enough, he picked up the notion from Rabbi Weissmandl that it was going to be possible, maybe, to convince the Germans, who were now in occupation of an ally, that being Hungary, it was possible to convince them that he and his group represented world Jewry. World Jewry, powerful, all-powerful, actually, and with a lot of disposable money and power and influence. Now, if there's anybody in this room who believes there's such a thing as world Jewry, you're probably in the wrong room. However, Adolf Hitler believed there was an all-powerful organization called World Jewry, and he put this in his book, Mein Kampf. So, the Germans, who were in charge at this point of Hungarian affairs, were hardly in a position to deny the existence of the all-powerful World Jewry. When Joel Brand first went to see Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann came to Budapest shortly after the very scattershot approach of the so-called invasion. He came with only one purpose in mind. His job was to eliminate all the Jews of Hungary. That was his only job. And he'd had quite a bit of experience in doing this already elsewhere, so he was all set to do it. Joel Brand went to see him and proposed that World Jewry would buy Jewish lives. And Eichmann said, well, that's terrific. what we need is some winterized trucks. And he sent Joel Brand to Istanbul to meet with representatives of world Jewry, where you can imagine the effect his words had on, first, the so-called representatives of world Jewry, who were a bunch of rather dispirited members of the Yeshuv, and they were there trying to figure out what to do about the catastrophe unfolding. They certainly had no winterized trucks. The proposal went both to the Americans and the British, was discussed in British Parliament, and needless to say, rejected, because there was no way they were going to give the Germans trucks to be used on any front. But the winterized suggested that the trucks would be used on the eastern fronts. And obviously, that would have really annoyed the Soviets. And neither the Americans nor the British had any desire to see the Soviets annoyed. They needed them as an ally. Having failed with that idea, and having lost Brand because he was not only without the slightest chance of winning in Istanbul, but he was arrested by the British and spent most of the rest of the war in jail. Kasztner went to see Eichmann himself. He went with Hansi, and he went by himself, and he went every day that Eichmann was there, and Eichmann was there most days. Eichmann thought it would take quite a lot to get Hungarian Jews deported. To his astonishment, the Hungarian government, the civil service, immediately came up with a plan of dividing the country into zones for deportations. And two chaps by the name of Andra and Bucky worked tirelessly on the ghettoization and ultimate removal of almost 500,000 of their fellow citizens, many of whom, incidentally, went into the wagons, the cattle cars. They went wearing their First World War decorations for bravery. They were an extraordinary lot of people from all over the country who had had relatively peaceful lives, and the truth is, they never expected this could happen. Right up until the end, there were no immediate memories of pogroms in Hungary. Hungarian Jews were lawyers and actors, and they were writers, famous writers. They were revered poets. They were in the fabric of society. One of them, well, there were several Olympic champions who happened also to be Hungarian Jews, but one of them, I can see you nodding, yes, one of them you may have seen in Robert Lantars's film, yes. That is based on a true story. He was a great swordsman. Back to Kasztner. At this point, it had become improbable that he could do more than save maybe 100,000. He was hoping for 100,000, and he kept going up the hill to the Majestic Hotel. Any of you been to Budapest? You may have seen it. It's on the Buddhist side. The building is still there. He would trudge up to the Majestic Hotel and go to see Eichmann. And he developed all these habits of trying to be tough. This is a little guy from Kolozsvár. He learned how to chain smoke because Eichmann was chain smoking. And Eichmann had a habit of marching up and down and thumping his heels into the parquet floors, and Hansi taught Reszo how to do that because that's what powerful Germans do, and he was, after all, representing world Jewry. So he couldn't cower. He had to look powerful and tough. As the days went by, and the truth of what was going on in Poland had come to Hungary through a variety of means. The most obvious, Oskar Schindler. He came and he met Kasztner. In fact, he said in his memoir that Reszo Kasztner was the bravest man he had ever met. But Oskar Schindler came partly for the money, because at this point there was money coming from the Yeshuv for this group of rescuers to hand out and try and save people. So he came, and Rudolf Rabbi, who actually used to live, he was a professor in Vancouver, British Columbia. He was one of the people who escaped from Auschwitz-Birkenau. And he wrote a report on Auschwitz and warned that the guards in Birkenau were looking forward to eating Hungarian salami. He knew, and he was trying to convince everybody, that Hungarian Jews were next. And if you've been to Birkenau, has anybody here been to Auschwitz? I didn't know you'd been there, Harvey. Birkenau is where they arrived, not Auschwitz, but Birkenau. And you can still see the train tracks. And that is where my countrymen landed. 9 out of 10 were murdered on arrival. Kasztner, up on the hill in the Majestic, kept telling Eichmann that if all the Jews are dead, how can he hope for a deal? How can world Jewry influence the Allies to send? By this time, they'd given up on the trucks. They would have settled for other goods. But if there are no Jews to save, well, out of these discussions came the idea of perhaps 500, perhaps 400. It was very difficult to pin Eichmann down. Well, you can understand the difference between the two men. When one could have shot the other without fear of repercussions. The other had no power at all. So the negotiations went on and on and on, and I wrote about this in my book. The ultimate number was a lot fewer than Kasztner had hoped for. One of the charges against him is that he selected, Ben Hecht said that. He's totally wrong, by the way, Ben. Anyway, sorry, Rabbi, I shouldn't be disagreeing with you in your own synagogue, but...
I'm not supporting Ben Hecht.
Oh, I don't know. I just started with him. Anyway, where was I? Pardon? Selection. Kasztner didn't make the selection. He couldn't bear to make the selection. The selection was made by a small group of people that did not include him, and very likely, judging by the trial transcripts, the biggest voice in the committee was Rabbi Freudiger, who was a rabbi of the Orthodox synagogue in Budapest, not because he was the most popular guy, not because he had the most time, but because he was able to collect more silver than any of the other members of the group. He was the only rabbi in the group. So he had a little bit of authority. The ultimate group that got on that train included only 100 people who paid anything at all. The others went free. There were Halutzim. There were even a couple of young Poles. There were Orthodox from the East. There were Orthodox from Budapest. There were Reform. There were no religion whatsoever. There was an opera singer, etc. And my friend who's sitting over there, he was on that train. Thank you. Thank you. I hope one day he'll tell his story.
Yeah. I just have to say a few words, and I would like to really thank you. We have to thank this lady who really brought up the history in reality, which was just when you read it, just like you would be there and see everything which was done, thought by thought, one step after the other step. The same thing this lady has done a good job of her reporting in this book. And if you lived in those days in that area, in the time from Budapest, when I was down there was no way what to do. People didn't know. People didn't know what to do. We were running one on top of the other. We were running one on top of the other to find out actually how we could survive. For me, it was a time when they decided in my organization, which I belong to, the Zionist organization, it's called Habudim. They decide for us to go to Romania. And from Romania, it would be easy to go to Turkey and so on. But here you are. I'm a refugee myself, came down there and hardly spoke Hungarian. It would have been a big risk for me to take and travel by the train and be outside and talk to people. They would right away knew I would betray myself. In the time that Kasztner came in, like me, it was thousands and thousands of there, from Poland, even from Warsaw. Came there a lot of people. We made friends. I met a lot of them when we stopped over in Bergen-Belsen, where they took us in because the Allies at that time, when we went with the train, made an attack and they cut the rails, and the Germans had to put us somewhere. So they put us in Bergen-Belsen. And down there, I met a lot of people like me. So when I think of the job which was done by Kasztner, which came along in the Dandizan, it reminds me of Shivat Zion von den Jiden, Chazru mi Babel, and they came with Yirmiyahu to Jerusalem. A lot of them wouldn't go with it. They were better off to stay in Persia and serve the Persian. But a lot of them, there was a whole hullabaloo, and it came out, and the same thing, I could say there wasn't one man in the whole Jewish history who saved so many Jews, who was responsible for their life, that they are today alive, as this guy Kasztner. What killed them is politics. Politics, they played between one party of the Likud and the other party, which he belonged to the Mapai. And when you play with politics, nothing is true. Everything is swept under the carpet. So, my dear friend, if you want to ask me a few questions, I'm right here, and I lived through all the things. Thank you.
Now, that's all about the train. The train did get out, and all the people on the train, except for two men who crossed out of the Hungarian area of Bergen-Belsen to visit their daughters. Everybody else survived. But I'd like to now talk for a second about the other saving that Kasztner did. The number, as I mentioned earlier, is, according to Kasztner, it was 17,000. According to Lieutenant Colonel Argameyer, in his reports to Eichmann, the number was actually just over 20,000. And this is people who had been selected mostly from southern Hungary. And they were shipped through Strasshof, which is just outside Vienna, to help with rubble removal if they were small enough, and with farms, because farmers were all off fighting the good war for the Germans. For those people, he only paid $100 a head, which is not very much. Most of them survived, not all of them. The instructions to the people making the selection, which was what was left of Jewish authority in each of these ghettos, by then all the Jews in southern Hungary were in ghettos. The instructions were to find families with a lot of small children and to pick older men and women, because they were bound to be murdered as soon as they got to Birkenau. The small children were not counted when they added the numbers up, which may account for the difference between 17,000 and 20,000. One of the people in Strasshof and then eventually on a farm is Leslie Meisels. And Leslie and his beautiful wife Eva beside him are both here. And I'd love Leslie to say a few words.
Sorry. I was taking the keyboard. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Anne. I am definitely belonging to that group which says that Rudolf Kasztner was a hero, and he didn't deserve what he got. He was accused of being a traitor because out of that 1,685 people whom on the train on which this gentleman have been, and which actually happened to be exchanged from Bergen-Belsen on December the 4th, 1944 through Switzerland, there were 15 of his own families. He himself didn't put himself into that group to be exchanged and escape. I am asking a question. Any of you would be in that position that you can put together a large group of people and do not include members of your family? I definitely would. So I am not calling him because of that a traitor, but that is just one part of it. The other part, due to his negotiation with Eichmann and later on with Kurt Becker, the military commander, he achieved that approximately between 17 and 20,000 people were put into ICE on Austrian territory, using them as slave laborers. I happen to be one who in a small group was on a farm as a slave laborer all summer long. And later on, when they were not anything to use for us, they were putting us back through Strasshof into freight cars and ended up in Bergen-Belsen. We were supposed to be a second group to be exchanged. Again, part of Kasztner's work. Due to the advancement of the war, the front line, our exchange never took place. We were then transported from Bergen-Belsen on a train with a plan by the Nazis to Theresienstadt, still hoping for the exchange, or if not, then extermination. Fortunately, the 9th American Army 30th Infantry Division found us on an abandoned train on April 13, 1945, and liberated 2,500 emaciated skeletons on a train. I am one of the survivors of that train. I am, with my wife Eva, who is a survivor of the Budapest ghetto, saved twice by Raoul Wallenberg. We are very much involved in Holocaust education, and our memoirs have been printed by the Azrieli Foundation. Actually, if you wish, you can pick up a copy of it at the corner when you are going out, in which, in details, we are describing our experiences. Kasztner was underestimated in his good work for saving approximately 75% of those Jews on ice, meaning over 10,000 people survived because of his work. Not only the train, which this gentleman and Peter Monk among them have been, but us, the second group, which partially, unfortunately, in my case, went through Bergen-Belsen, and the majority in small groups have been liberated in and around Vienna. Thank you.
Be careful now. In order to write this book, I interviewed over 200 people, and I can't even remember how many books and documents I read before I came to the same conclusion that the two gentlemen who spoke had come to, that Kasztner, in fact, was a hero. Indeed, the truth is that there were certain things that Kasztner could not say at this trial of Malkiel Grunwald, which turned into the Kasztner trial. He could not, for example, say that the main reason he testified on behalf of a Nazi officer by the name of Becher was that he'd been asked by the leadership of the Yishuv at the time to see if there was any way that the money, the gold, the jewelry that had been given to Becher in 2 suitcases could be taken back. They also were fairly hopeful that they could track down Eichmann. And as you know, this considerable effort went into tracking Eichmann. All 3 of the German officers on whose behalf Kasztner had kind words to say knew where Eichmann was. And indeed, ultimately, Eichmann was found. Eichmann, at his trial in Israel, did talk about Kasztner, and he talked about Hansi. He had great regard for Hansi, he said. And he talked about the Jews on ice, about which you heard from my friend Leslie. He talked about them as Kasztner's Jews. This is the 17 to 20,000. This is in the trial transcripts. Kasztner was shot and killed after the trial was over. And can you hear me? And we're going to show you a little film clip, I hope, of another film on a DVD. The man who killed him is a guy called Ecksteins. And yes, he did. Kasztner did not survive, but Ecksteins did. And as we're going to show the film, I'm going to end here. Just wanted to say these things. One of the last people I interviewed in Israel was Peretz Revis, whose name came up in the film. Peretz was the person who said to me, he was in charge of saving children, by the way. Peretz was in a kibbutz. He was working with Kasztner, but he was also working alone. He lived in Slovakia. Anyway, one of the things he said to me when I was writing this book, he said, "You're very brave," because of Schindler, the question always is why he bothered to save any Jews. But because Kasztner was a Jew, the question is, why didn't he save more? Being a Jew is never easy.
He had the power to save Jews if he got money. And that he turned the train around that was already on the way to Auschwitz. Did you come across anything like that? I was on that train. Sure. That's why I was on the train. He was on that train. And we ended up in Strasbourg, and I ended up in Vienna. It was the same train.
It is the same train, but there was more than one train. There were several trains, and once two of the trains that were supposed to go to Strasshof accidentally, so they said, they went to Birkenau, two of them, but there was more than one train. So yes, you were part of the approximately $100 a head Jews on ice.
I wondered all my life how we did that.
Hi, my question is, how much money did Kasztner pay, you said he paid to Becker? Did Eichmann get anything? And because eventually he seems not to have any money. And what happened to the money that Becker had?
Well, there are so many answers, I don't even know how to begin. Nobody knows exactly how much was paid. Partly because as money, it wasn't cash. Mostly it was jewelry, it was gold, it was coins, it was a variety of different goods. The cash part was the most problematic, because as time went on and the value of the cash deteriorated, Becker kept saying, well, you owe me more money because it's no longer worth what you said it was. So how much exactly he got is part of the conundrum of all this, and one of the reasons why Moshe Sharat's leadership was hopeful that some of it could still be found. Becker claimed he returned it all through a man called Springman, who had been part of the rescue committee, and whom he saved from an extermination camp. But oddly enough, Becker, who had not been particularly wealthy, suddenly became exceptionally rich after the war. Exceptionally rich. There is a group of German journalists went after the story, but the book was only published in German, about how he came to be such a wealthy man. He was a celebrated industrialist, and there isn't any doubt that the money came from Hungarian Jews.
What are the rumors, what's true, what's not, what have you been able to research? And from that aspect, it was almost a conspiracy from the Israeli government at the time that wanted to eliminate it, and for what reason? So they ignored that some crazy guy decided to kill him. It seems to be a bit more complex. Right?
Oh no, he wasn't. He was not alone. There were 3 of them, and they were all caught, and they all served time in jail. But no, it was proven beyond a doubt that they were acting on their own under the influence of, indeed, an former Irgun member, but there were no orders given. They were acting on their own, and they believed they were doing the right thing. And Eckstein's in the clip that you haven't seen, which is in this Killing Kasztner film. Eckstein's actually says at some point that he believed it was he still believed it was the right thing to do. But then today, I got an email from one of the survivors, and he's taken it back. And today's Ynet newsroom, he's now 81, and he says he was sorry. You've seen this? Yeah.
There was a movie set someday on What I'm Not, and then there was a fictional German figure that is the same person.
It's a fictional, but yes.
Because it's a sort of similar situation that we had in Germany and in Budapest, and then they basically get money to let them out, and then.
It's a story that has a lot of versions and a lot of legs, and there are several novels that I've read. Can you hear me? There's several novels that I've read based on this story, and there are several films, including the one that you've seen.
Besides the 1,700 people who were saved from these trains, you said 1,700 people were saved from the trains. Throughout the evening, you said that 17,000 to 20,000 people were actually indirectly saved from the accident.
Yes, 2 different actions.
So can you explain?
Yes, there was
1,700 to 20,000.
Well, the train was one action, and the Jews who went through Strasshof for forced labor, the group that Leslie Meisels was talking about is a separate group. One group paid a lot of money, the other group very little. The people on the train all survived, and more than half of the people through Strasshof survived. But the record was not so great. So in total, it's probably around 20,000 people.
You mentioned that the payments that the Germans accepted from Kasztner were mainly in goods that intuitively the Germans could have stolen anyhow. They didn't need Kasztner to give it up. So the question is, well, Kasztner may not have been a collaborator. If you look at March 1944, that was the beginning of the Soviet offensive. I think Austria was starting to be bombed by the Allies. So was he mainly a pawn by the Germans trying to prepare for the post-Nuremberg trials and their defense after the war?
I believe that everybody in the German command at that point, with the possible exception of madmen like Eichmann, would have foreseen that the war could not last and that Germany was going to lose the war. But despite that, instead of using trains to carry troops, they used trains to go to Auschwitz. So, of course, Becker knew. And he did ask Kasztner to testify on his behalf when it was all over, as did Wislitzen and Krume. So, were they using him? Yes. Was he using them? Yes. It was a very, very complicated situation where everybody was using everybody else, but Kasztner was able to achieve something. And Becker got enormously wealthy. I'd like to talk at length about Becker because he was really a bad guy. All of these people were unbelievably terrible. And that Becker should, at least Wislitzen was executed, but not Becker. He just got rich.
I'm very interested in the Jewish community of Hungary. Coming from Hungary myself, I'm very interested in the reaction of Hungarian Jews. And has anything been done in Budapest? Set up something, a memorial? What's happening with us Jews in Hungary?
Well, yes, there is a Holocaust museum on Pava Street. There have been enormous discussions and debates about its leadership, but let's not go there. It would take too long. All about Kasztner? All there is on Kasztner is a small plaque in the Dohány Street synagogue. That's all there is. Oh yes, I interviewed a lot of Hungarians about him. Well, a lot of Hungarian Jews were not saved. And I've met a lot of Hungarian Jews who have a great deal to be angry about. No, but if you've seen your whole family slaughtered, and another guy's family is saved, you're entitled to your rage. Oh, did you...
Sorry, please.
We had a speaker here a few years ago who was writing a book about the Eichmann tribe. I can't remember her name. And she said in that book that when Eichmann, during his trial, was asked about Kasztner, supposedly he made a comment that I admired his guts.
It's true.
I don't know whether it is true or not.
It is true. But the person he admired most was Hansi.
The book is Deborah Lipstadt, The Eichmann Trial. Very highly recommended. It's a very strong antidote to Hannah Arendt's book on the Eichmann Trial.
I just want to give compliments to the people when I see the train, to the people who organized the train in the thing, because I know we were on that train. And when we already knew we are on the way, suddenly the train started to go slowly, just slowly. There was hardly any guard on the train. And suddenly, out of the bushes surrounding, jumped out tens of boys and girls. They all came from the Bnei Akiva in Slovakia. And they were a real strong organization. They jumped on the train and we welcomed them, and there was something we were all shocked about it, how it happened.
Are there any further questions? I'd like to... yes, please. The question is, how was the selection made about the Kasztner, on who went on the Kasztner train?
The committee decided they would try and work on the principle of a kind of Noah's Ark. So there would be a certain number of people representing one profession, one area. So there'd be somebody from everywhere. It's and as my friend just now pointed out, some people got on the train by accident, and there was a Polish woman who threw her son onto the train, and he was adopted eventually by a couple in Israel, which is where he still lives. Or at least I hope he's still alive, because so many of the people I interviewed are not.
Anything else? I'd just like to make one point here, if I may. Obviously, the discussions about Kasztner are not necessarily the result of objectivity. And when people experience the same event and they have different conclusions about how that event turns out, one has to question whether or not their understanding of what occurred is subjective or objective. Looking for truth is very difficult, especially as time passes. And I think we're fortunate that we had somebody like Anna Porter, who does something which is really not very popular today, and that is talks truth and doesn't care about the political correctness. Firstly, it was an honor to be asked to be with you, and I'm glad I had the opportunity to be here. And I want to thank the BAYT again for organizing this event and Holocaust Education Week, and may all your work be successful. Thank you very much.